Alexander Montgomery had always lived in the lap of luxury. From the moment he was born, he was surrounded by wealth, privilege, and status. His family owned one of the largest and most successful business empires in the country, and from a young age, it was clear that Alexander would inherit this legacy. He attended the finest schools, traveled the world, and rubbed elbows with the elite in society. Everything he could ever want was within his reach. Yet, for all of his riches and success, there was something missing in his life. He was a handsome man, tall, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that commanded attention in every room he entered. His jet-black hair was always perfectly styled, and his tailored suit spoke of money and sophistication. He was the kind of man who caught the eye of every woman, and every man envied him. On the outside, Alexander seemed to have it all: luxury cars, a beautiful mansion, a high-profile career, and an army of people at his beck and call. But on the inside, Alexander was empty. Despite his wealth, despite all the people who surrounded him, Alexander felt profoundly alone. The reason for his isolation wasn't just that he was often misunderstood. It was because he realized that no one saw him for who he truly was. People saw his bank account, his luxurious lifestyle, his power and influence, but no one cared to see him for the man beneath the wealth. They loved the idea of him, the version of himself that was polished, wealthy, and successful. But Alexander had never felt like he was truly known or loved for the person he was on the inside. It was in the midst of one of his most glamorous parties, hosted at his sprawling mansion on the edge of the city, that the loneliness hit him the hardest. The ballroom was alive with chatter and laughter. Beautiful women in designer dresses swirled around in a cloud of perfume. Men in sharp suits discussed their latest business ventures. Music played softly in the background, but Alexander felt like he was drowning in a sea of voices. He looked around, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests. There were many people here who wanted to be seen with him, to be photographed with him, to say they were his friends. But no one was really interested in him, who he was as a person. He was just a symbol of wealth, a key to social advancement for those who sought it. No one seemed to care about the man who had been raised in a world of expectations, pressure, and relentless ambition. This realization settled heavily in his chest. He had everything money could buy, yet he had nothing that truly mattered. No one loved him for his character, his passions, or his vulnerabilities. They only loved what his wealth could provide. The idea of continuing to live in this shallow existence filled him with a deep sense of dread. Alexander was tired of living a life where people only saw his riches, his status, and his carefully constructed image. He longed for something deeper, something real. He wanted to be seen, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had hopes, dreams, and fears, just like anyone else. But how could he find that? Alexander sat at the bar in his mansion, swirling his drink in silence. The party continued around him, but he felt like an outsider looking in. He thought about his relationships, his romantic entanglements over the years. They had all been empty. The women he dated were beautiful and glamorous, but they never truly cared for him. They admired his wealth and status, but none of them ever really took the time to understand him. They saw him as a prize to be won, a golden ticket to a life of luxury. He wasn't a man to them, he was an object of desire. But in that moment, something inside Alexander snapped. He had spent too many years hiding behind his wealth, too many years letting people love him for the wrong reasons. He was done with it. He needed to escape. The decision came quickly, almost impulsively. Alexander knew what he had to do. He couldn't find real love unless he was willing to step away from the life that had defined him for so long. He would have to disappear. He would have to become someone else, someone who wasn't defined by his wealth, someone who would be judged by his character, not his bank account. The idea of living a normal life, a humble life, filled him with both fear and excitement. It wasn't going to be easy, but it felt necessary. Alexander couldn't keep living the way he had been. He couldn't keep pretending to be the man people wanted him to be. He had to find someone who would love him, not because of his money, but because of who he truly was. The first thing Alexander did was buy a used car, a modest, second-hand sedan. He didn't need anything flashy. In fact, he chose a car that blended in, one that wouldn't draw attention. It was the polar opposite of the expensive sports cars he used to drive, and he felt a strange sense of liberation as he handed over the money for the vehicle. Next, he rented a small apartment in the city, far from his mansion, far from the people who knew him. He packed a few belongings and left behind the extravagance of his former life. Gone were the extravagant dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, the designer suits, the private jets. For the first time in his life, Alexander was truly on his own. No staff to cater to his every whim, no public relations team to manage his image. It was just him, one man, a car, and a modest apartment. The final step of his plan was to apply for a job as a rideshare driver. Alexander wasn't sure why he thought this would work, but he knew he needed to experience life from the ground up. He needed to connect with people who weren't impressed by his wealth, people who would see him as a regular person. The first few days were humbling. Gone were the days of sitting in his office, making multi-million-dollar deals. Now, Alexander found himself behind the wheel of his old sedan, picking up strangers and driving them across town. It was a simple job, but it brought a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The passengers would enter the car with a polite, "Hello," but they never lingered on who he was or what he did for a living. They simply needed a ride. It wasn't easy. He had no staff to help with the logistics, no assistant to book his rides or answer questions. He had to learn the app, figure out the best routes, and deal with traffic all on his own. At first, the work was exhausting. He missed the luxury of his old life, the comfortable cars, the private planes, the expensive dinners. He had to stop at gas stations, wait in long lines, and live a life that felt far removed from his former existence. But as the days passed, something inside him began to change. The more he drove, the more he saw the world through the eyes of ordinary people. The conversations he had with his passengers were honest and raw. People shared their stories with him, stories of hardship, dreams, and simple pleasures. He learned that people didn't need to be wealthy to be happy. Many of his passengers found joy in small moments, spending time with family, laughing with friends, and making a difference in their communities. This was the life Alexander had been searching for, a life where people were valued for who they were, not what they had. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection. It was on one of those long days of driving that Alexander met Sarah. She was a passenger who needed a ride across town, and from the moment she entered his car, he felt something shift inside him. Sarah was in her mid-20s, with long, dark hair that cascaded down her back in waves. She had a soft smile that was both kind and genuine, and when she spoke, it was with a quiet, unassuming confidence. Unlike many of the other passengers Alexander had driven, Sarah didn't seem at all interested in his background. She didn't ask about his life, his work, or his wealth. She simply said hello and settled in, looking out the window as the car moved through the city streets. As they drove, Sarah shared little details about her life, her job at a local bakery, her love for cooking, and her desire to someday open her own cafe. Her words weren't grand or dramatic, but they were sincere. She didn't boast about her achievements or complain about her struggles. She simply spoke about her life with a quiet grace, as though she was content with the simple pleasures of everyday life. For Alexander, it was a revelation. Here was someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth or his status. She didn't even know who he was, and she didn't care. She saw him as just another person, and that was exactly what he needed. The following weeks were a blur for Alexander. His life as a rideshare driver had become more routine, but with each passing day he felt himself changing. He spent long hours behind the wheel, driving passengers across the city. Most of them were in a hurry, absorbed in their own thoughts or conversations. But it was Sarah who continued to occupy his mind, Every time he thought about her, it was as though a warmth filled his chest. There was something so genuine about her, so real, that it left him feeling exposed and vulnerable, yet in the best possible way. Sarah had started taking rides with him more frequently. Their conversations had grown longer and deeper, and Alexander found himself looking forward to every moment they spent together. She was easy to talk to, not because she was always saying the right thing, but because she listened. She asked about his life, but in a way that didn't make him feel uncomfortable. She never pressured him to reveal more than he was willing to share, and somehow that made him feel safe. One afternoon, after a particularly long ride, Sarah mentioned her dream of opening a bakery. Her voice was soft but filled with passion. She spoke of the joy she found in baking, the way the smell of fresh bread could bring people together. There was a certain light in her eyes when she talked about it, a fire that Alexander hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. She was young, yes, but there was an undeniable maturity about her. It wasn't the kind of maturity that came with age or experience. It was the kind that came from living a life filled with purpose, even in its simplest forms. Sarah's life wasn't perfect. She didn't come from wealth or luxury. In fact, she lived in a modest apartment, and most of her money went towards supporting her mother, who had fallen ill a few years ago. Yet, Sarah never seemed burdened by it. She had learned to appreciate the little things, simple pleasures like a cup of tea in the morning, the beauty of the first snowfall, the laughter of a friend. Alexander admired her for that. It was something he hadn't known how to appreciate in years. He had always been focused on success, achievement, and acquiring more. He had surrounded himself with things, expensive cars, fine clothing, and luxury, thinking that it would bring him happiness. But in Sarah's presence, he began to see just how little all those things mattered. There was one evening, after a long day of driving, when Alexander found himself parked outside a small cafe. He had driven Sarah there after her shift ended, and they had been talking as usual. As they both sat in the car, Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the simplicity of the moment. He hadn't realized just how much he had missed real human connection. It wasn't about the wealth he had or the luxury he had been accustomed to. It was about the people who cared for him, who saw him for who he truly was. "Do you ever wonder," Alexander asked quietly, "if there's more to life than all of this?" He gestured vaguely at the city around them, the tall buildings, the flashing lights, the hustle of urban life. Sarah smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "I think people get caught up in wanting more and more, thinking that's what will make them happy. But sometimes, it's the little things that make life worth living." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "You know, I used to think that having a big house, a fancy car, would make me happy. But now I find happiness in my work, in helping my mom, and in the little moments of joy that life brings." Alexander looked at her, feeling as though her words had pierced straight through him. It was as if she had seen inside him, recognized the yearning he had been trying to ignore. She wasn't just talking about baking or her own life, she was speaking to his soul. As much as Alexander admired Sarah and her approach to life, he couldn't deny the internal conflict that had been growing within him. There was still a part of him that missed the life he had left behind. The temptation to return to the world of luxury, to step back into his role as a powerful CEO, tugged at him every day. He missed the ease of his former life, the endless parties, the glamorous events, the status that came with being Alexander Montgomery. But with every passing day, he became more and more aware of how hollow that life had been. His wealth had never made him feel truly connected to anyone. He had always been surrounded by people who wanted something from him, who wanted his money, his influence, or his position. It was a difficult realization to face. For so long, Alexander had believed that wealth was the key to happiness, that if he could just attain enough, everything else would fall into place. But now, with Sarah, he was beginning to see the truth. It wasn't the things he had that mattered. It was the relationships he built, the trust he earned, and the love he shared. But still, there was a fear deep inside him. Could he really let go of everything he had worked for? Could he truly embrace this new, simpler life? Or would he always be haunted by the memories of his past life, of wealth and luxury? One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Alexander found himself sitting alone in his small apartment. He stared out the window at the city lights below, the same lights that had once filled him with excitement and ambition. Now, they felt cold and distant, as if they were mocking him. In that moment, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Sarah asking if he wanted to join her for a walk through the park. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of his internal struggle. But then he realized that he didn't want to face this alone. He needed Sarah's presence. He needed her lightness, her sincerity, to remind him of what was important. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, the uncertainty still lingering in his chest, but no longer feeling quite as heavy. Sarah had become his anchor, the one person who made him feel seen, heard, and valued. In her company, he no longer felt like a billionaire trapped by his own wealth. He felt like Alexander, a man with hopes, fears, and dreams of his own. Weeks passed, and Alexander found himself growing closer to Sarah in ways he hadn't expected. He began to open up to her, sharing the parts of himself that he had hidden for so long. His loneliness, his fear of being judged, his deep-seated desire to be loved for who he was, not for his wealth, became topics of conversation between them. Sarah listened without judgment, offering nothing more than understanding and encouragement. She had never known the life Alexander had lived, but she had known her own share of struggles and hardships. Her mother's illness, the difficulty of making ends meet, the pressure to succeed in a world that didn't always seem kind. Sarah's life hadn't been easy, but she had learned how to find joy in the smallest of things. One evening, after they had spent a long day together, Alexander found himself sitting on a bench in the park with Sarah. The air was crisp, and the stars twinkled overhead. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt still, when the chaos of the world seemed to fade away. "Sarah," Alexander said, his voice unsteady, "there's something I need to tell you, something I've been hiding." Sarah turned to him, her face soft with curiosity, but also trust. She had come to know him in ways no one else had, and she could see the weight of his words before they were even spoken. "I'm not just a driver," Alexander continued, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm Alexander Montgomery. I come from a family with a lot of wealth. I've been hiding it, trying to live a normal life, but the truth is, I've been running from who I am. I didn't want you to see me as just another rich guy, someone who only had money to offer." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She didn't respond immediately, and the silence between them felt heavy. But it wasn't the kind of silence that filled Alexander with dread. It was the kind of silence that allowed space for honesty, for truth. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice calm and steady. "I already knew," she said with a small smile. "I could tell there was more to you than met the eye. But it didn't change how I felt about you. You're still the same person to me, the kind man who listens, who cares. I don't need anything else from you." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. For a moment, he felt the weight of his confession lift, replaced by something warmer, a sense of acceptance he hadn't known in a long time. As time went on, Alexander continued to spend more and more time with Sarah. They grew closer, their bond deepening with each conversation, each shared experience. Alexander learned to live without the trappings of his former life. He found joy in the simple things, the warmth of Sarah's smile, the comfort of her company, and the peaceful moments they shared together. And Sarah, in turn, learned from Alexander's vulnerability. She realized that true wealth wasn't measured by the number of zeros in a bank account, but by the love and connection one shared with others. She had always believed in the importance of kindness, but being with Alexander showed her that there was more to life than she had ever imagined. They began to build a future together, not one built on wealth or status, but on mutual respect, understanding, and love. Alexander knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt content. He had found the love he had been searching for, not the kind that came with luxury, but the kind that came with real, genuine connection.